Dating a broke man is exhausting. I cannot keep pretending this is enough. The words cut clean through the soft jazz and quiet clinking of glasses, sharp enough to silence everything inside Ethan Blake's chest. He sat across from her, perfectly still, his fingers resting beside a cheap ceramic coffee cup that had long gone cold. Olivia Hayes did not look at him when she said it. She was laughing, tilting her head toward the polished man in a tailored suit standing near their table, as if Ethan was already invisible. The restaurant glowed with warm golden light, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was, but nothing could soften what he had just heard. Outside, the city hummed with late evening traffic, headlights streaking across rain-slick streets. But inside that moment, everything slowed. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to his wrist. The only thing he still wore was a simple watch. Worn leather, faint scratches across the glass. It had once belonged to his father. He could still hear the old man's voice in quiet echoes. Money does not change people, son. It reveals them. Ethan inhaled slowly, steady, controlled, like a man used to holding power in silence. He had built an empire from nothing, a company that spanned across states, industries, and influence. Yet here he was being measured by what he no longer appeared to have. Olivia finally glanced at him, her smile fading just enough to look impatient. Are you even listening, Ethan? He met her eyes, calm, unreadable. Always. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ethan reached for his wallet, thin now by design, and placed a few bills on the table. Not enough for the kind of place Olivia loved, but enough to cover what he had ordered. The man in the suit, Ryan Cole, stepped closer, his presence loud without effort. You deserve better than this. Olivia, he said casually, eyes flicking toward Ethan with a smirk that did not bother to hide its meaning. Olivia did not correct him. That silence said more than anything else. Ethan stood, pushing his chair back slowly, the faint scrape against the polished floor echoing louder than expected. For a brief second, Olivia looked almost uncertain, as if something inside her hesitated, but it vanished just as quickly as it came. Ethan adjusted his jacket, plain, slightly worn, nothing like the custom-tailored suits hanging untouched in his penthouse closet. Then he looked at her one last time, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with something far colder. Understanding. You are right, he said quietly. You should not have to pretend. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Olivia blinked, confused by how easily he accepted it. Ethan turned and walked away, past the glowing bar, past the mirrored walls, past the life he had chosen to step out of. No one stopped him. No one recognized him. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blake, the man who controlled billions, disappeared into the night as if he were nothing at all. But what Olivia did not know, what no one in that room could possibly imagine, was that this was not the end of something. This was the beginning of a test that would change everything. The night air was colder than Ethan expected, sharp against his skin as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city stretching endlessly in front of him, alive and indifferent. Rain from earlier still clung to the pavement, reflecting neon lights and passing headlights like fractured pieces of another world. For a moment, he stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle inside him where something heavier had just broken. Behind him, through the glass, he could still see Olivia laughing, her hand lightly touching Ryan Cole's arm, already moving on as if Ethan had never mattered. Ethan looked away. That was all he needed to see. By the time he reached the corner, his phone buzzed once in his pocket. Clara. He did not answer. Not yet. Instead, he kept walking, past blocks he had not visited in years, past storefronts that no longer recognized him, until the polished skyline gave way to something quieter, rougher, more honest. An hour later, Ethan stood in front of a narrow apartment building tucked between a closed laundromat and a liquor store with flickering lights. The sign above the entrance was half burned out, a place he had chosen on purpose. No one here would know his name. No one here would care. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning chemicals. The overhead light buzzed softly, casting a dull glow over scuffed walls and worn doors. Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, as if each step was taking him further away from the life he had built. When he unlocked the door to his new apartment, the space greeted him with silence. Small, bara, a single window facing an alley, a couch that had seen better years, a narrow kitchen with a humming refrigerator that sounded louder than it should. Ethan set his keys down on the counter and stood there, taking it in. This was what he wanted. This was the test. He removed his jacket and folded it neatly over the back of a chair, then rolled up his sleeves, revealing the watch again. The worn leather strap sat firmly against his wrist, steady, familiar. He ran his thumb across the scratched glass, remembering the day his father had given it to him, back when they had nothing but a two-bedroom house and a promise that things could be better. Ethan exhaled slowly and walked to the sink, turning on the water. Cold. Real. No luxury. No illusion. Just truth. The next morning came early. The sunlight that filtered through the thin blinds was pale and unforgiving, nothing like the controlled warmth of his penthouse windows. Ethan sat at the edge of the couch, tying the laces of a pair of worn work boots he had not touched in years. They felt different now, heavier somehow, or maybe it was everything else that had changed. His phone buzzed again. Clara. This time, he answered. Her voice came through immediately, controlled but urgent. Ethan, where are you? The board is asking questions. The investors are calling. He closed his eyes briefly, then spoke, calm and measured. Tell them what they need to hear. Then I'm stepping away. Silence followed on the other end, thick with disbelief. You are risking everything, she said quietly. Ethan opened his eyes and looked around the small apartment, at the peeling paint, at the cracked tile near the door, at the life he had chosen to step into. No, he replied. I am finally seeing everything. He ended the call before she could respond. Outside, the city was already moving. Car engines, distant sirens, voices blending into the rhythm of another ordinary day. Ethan grabbed his jacket and stepped out into it, just another man walking. Down the street, unnoticed, unrecognized, and for the first time in years, completely stripped of everything that had once defined him. And somewhere across the city, Olivia was waking up in a different world, one filled with polished floors, expensive coffee, and the illusion that she had made the right choice. She did not know yet that the man she had just walked away from was not gone. He was watching, waiting, and about to learn exactly who she really was when everything she thought she valued was put to the test. The city did not slow down for anyone, and by the third morning, Ethan Blake felt it in every step he took along the cracked sidewalks and crowded intersections. The rhythm of his new life had no room for hesitation. Car horns echoed between buildings, delivery trucks rumbled past, and people brushed shoulders without a second glance, each one carrying their own urgency. Ethan moved among them, unnoticed, just another man in worn boots and a plain jacket, his presence blending into the background of a world that no longer been around him. He found work the way many others did in that part of the city, through a handwritten sign taped to the dusty window of a small hardware store. Help needed. Cash paid daily. No questions asked. Inside, the air smelled of metal and wood dust, the shelves lined with tools that had been handled by hundreds of hands before his. The owner, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked Ethan over once, measuring him without interest. You ever done manual work before? He asked. Ethan nodded. A long time ago. The man shrugged and pointed toward the back. Then start with unloading the shipment. No breaks until it's done. Ethan did not argue. He stepped into the narrow storage area where boxes were stacked high, each one heavier than it looked. As he lifted the first crate, the strain pulled through his arms and shoulders, muscles remembering something they had not felt in years. The weight was real, honest. Every movement demanded effort. Every breath came harder than the last, but there was something grounding in it. No boardrooms, no negotiations, no illusions, just work. Hours passed before he finally stepped back, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt, his hands marked with faint cuts from rough edges. The owner glanced at the cleared. space and gave a short nod before handing him a few folded bills. Come back tomorrow if you want more. Ethan accepted the money without a word. It was not much, barely enough to cover a meal and the cheapest groceries, but that was not the point. The test had begun. Later that afternoon, he stopped at a small diner on the corner of a quieter street, the kind of place most people overlooked. The sign outside flickered slightly, and the windows were lined with simple curtains that had faded over time. Inside, the atmosphere was warm in a different way, softer, filled with the low hum of conversation and the scent of fresh coffee. Ethan took a seat near the counter, his body still carrying the fatigue of the day. A woman in her late 60s approached him, her movements steady, her expression kind but observant. "What can I get you, honey?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the menu, then back at her. "Just coffee." She tilted her head slightly. "You look like you need more than that." He offered a faint smile. "Coffee is fine." She did not argue, but when she returned, she placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him along with the coffee. "On the house," she said simply before moving on. Ethan looked at the food for a moment, surprised by the gesture. He had not asked for it. He had not earned it. Yet there it was, given without expectation. He picked up his fork slowly, the warmth of the meal grounding him in a way he had not expected. Across the city, Olivia Hayes sat at a sunlit table in a modern cafe, her fingers wrapped around a cup that cost more than Ethan had just earned in an hour. Ryan Cole sat across from her, confident, relaxed, every detail of his appearance carefully maintained. He leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth. "You do not have to struggle anymore, Olivia. Not when you have options." She smiled, but there was something uncertain beneath it, something she pushed aside as quickly as it appeared. "I know," she replied, her tone light, almost convincing. "It is just an adjustment." Ryan chuckled softly. "You will get used to better things. Trust me." Olivia nodded, her gaze drifting briefly to the window, watching the city move beyond the glass. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her expression, a memory perhaps, or a question she did not want to answer. Then it was gone. Back at the diner, Ethan finished the last bite of his meal and stood, placing the folded bills on the counter despite the woman's earlier words. She noticed and shook her head as she approached. "I said it was on the house." Ethan met her eyes, calm and sincere. "Then consider this for the next person who needs it more than I do." The woman studied him for a moment, something deeper passing through her gaze, as if she recognized a truth he had not spoken out loud. "You are not what you seem," she said quietly. Ethan glanced down at the worn watch on his wrist, then back at her. "Neither are most people," he replied. And with that, he stepped back into the city, the weight of the day still in his bones, but something else beginning to settle beneath it. Clarity. Because the further he walked away from the life he had built, the more clearly he could see the one truth he had always known but never truly tested. And soon, very soon, Olivia would face that same truth, without the comfort of illusion to protect her. The days began to blur together, each one folding into the next with a quiet, relentless rhythm that left little room for anything else. By the end of the first week, Ethan Blake no longer felt like a visitor in this new life. The early mornings, the weight of boxes, the ache in his shoulders, the smell of dust and steel, it all settled into something almost routine. What had once been unfamiliar was now expected. What had once been beneath him now felt strangely grounding. He woke before sunrise, the faint gray light slipping through the thin blinds, and sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, letting the silence gather around him before the city began its noise. His hand moved instinctively to the watch on his wrist, his thumb brushing over the worn leather strap as if it anchored him to something real. Then he stood, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into another day that demanded nothing from him except effort. At the hardware store, the owner no longer questioned him. Ethan worked without complaint, without hesitation, finishing tasks. Others avoided, lifting more than expected, staying later when needed. There was no recognition in it, no praise, but there was a quiet respect forming, the kind that did not need to be spoken. It showed in the way the owner handed him his pay, without counting twice, in a way other workers gave a short nod when he passed. Ethan did not seek it, But he noticed. Across the city, Olivia Hayes was learning a different kind of routine. Her mornings began later now, sunlight spilling across polished marble floors, the air filled with the soft hum of luxury that no longer felt new. Ryan Cole had made sure of that. Expensive breakfasts, tailored dresses, invitations to places that once felt out of reach. On the surface, everything had improved. Everything was easier. Yet something beneath it all felt less certain, like a reflection that did not quite match the image it was supposed to show. That afternoon, Ryan took her to a rooftop restaurant overlooking the skyline, the kind of place where the city looked distant and controlled, reduced to a view instead of a reality. "You belong up here, Olivia," he said, his voice smooth, confident, as if he were stating a fact that required no argument. She smiled, but her eyes drifted for a moment, unfocused, as if searching for something she could not name. "It is beautiful," she replied softly. Ryan leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "It is more than that. It is where you stop settling." Olivia nodded. Yet the word settling lingered in her mind longer than it should have. That evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one, Ethan returned to the small diner on the corner, the familiar warmth greeting him as soon as he stepped inside. The woman from before looked up from behind the counter and gave him a knowing smile. "Back again," she said. Ethan took the same seat as before, his movements quieter now, more at ease. "It seems like a good place to end the day." She poured him coffee without asking, setting the cup in front of him with a gentle nod. "You work hard today," she observed. Ethan glanced down at his hands, the faint cuts and roughness more visible now. It was an honest day. She studied him for a moment, then leaned slightly against the counter. "Most people run from a life like that." Ethan lifted the cup, the warmth seeping into his fingers. "Most people have something to protect." She raised an eyebrow. "And you do not." Ethan took a slow sip before answering. "I'm trying to find out." The woman smiled faintly, as if she understood more than he had said. "Well, you came to the right place for that. People show who they are when things are simple. No masks, no extras, just choices." Ethan nodded, her words settling somewhere deeper than he expected. Outside, the night moved on, steady and indifferent, but inside that small diner, something quiet was taking shape. A clarity that did not come from wealth or power, but from absence. From seeing what remained when everything else was stripped away. And somewhere across the city, Olivia sat in a car that cost more than Ethan's entire apartment building, staring out at the passing streets as Ryan spoke about plans, about opportunities, about a future that sounded perfect on the surface. She listened, she smiled, she agreed when expected, but her mind drifted, uninvited, back to a simpler image. A small table, a quiet man, a look she had not understood at the time. She shook it off, turning back to Ryan with practiced ease, but the thought lingered, faint and persistent, like a question that had not yet been asked. And as both of their worlds continued to move in opposite directions, the distance between truth and illusion grew thinner with each passing day. The shift did not happen all at once, not in a single moment that could be pointed to and named, but in small choices, quiet reactions, and the subtle ways Olivia Hayes began to pull away from anything that reminded her of the life she had just left behind. By the second week, the difference was no longer something that could be ignored. It showed in the way she hesitated before answering Ethan's messages, in the way her tone changed when his name came up in conversation, in the way she carefully avoided places they used to go together. It was not loud or dramatic. It was gradual, almost polite, but it carried a coldness that had not been there before. That afternoon, Ethan stood outside a modest coffee shop, the kind with chipped paint on the doorframe and a bell that rang too sharply when someone stepped inside. It was a place Olivia used to like before everything changed, before expectations grew larger than moments. He had asked her to meet him there, a simple request, something familiar, something real. When she finally arrived, she paused just outside the door, her reflection caught briefly in the glass. Her coat was new, tailored, expensive. Her posture different, more controlled. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room until they found him sitting at a small table near the window. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. Then she walked over, her heels clicking softly against the worn floor. "You could have picked somewhere nicer," she said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Ethan studied her quietly before answering. "This used to be your favorite place." She gave a small shrug as she sat down. People change. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than she intended. Ethan nodded slightly, as if accepting that truth, though something in his expression remained unreadable. A waitress approached and set down 2 cups of coffee, one in front of each of them, the steam rising between them like a fragile barrier. Olivia glanced at it briefly. "I'm not really drinking coffee like this anymore." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Like what?" She hesitated, searching for the right words, then gave up trying to soften it. "Cheap." The word lingered in the air, heavier than it should have been. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady. "It still tastes the same." Olivia let out a quiet breath, her patience thinning. "That is not the point, Ethan. You cannot just pretend everything is fine when it is not. This is not the life I want." Ethan watched her for a moment, the noise of the coffee shop fading into the background as her words settled into place. "What life do you want?" Olivia looked at him, really looked this time, as if trying to reconcile the man sitting in front of her with the one she thought she knew. "I want stability. I want security. I want to know that I am not going to have to worry about every dollar, every decision, every future plan." She paused, then added more quietly, "I want more than this." Ethan's hand rested on the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the worn surface, grounding himself in the moment. "And what if this is temporary?" Olivia shook her head almost immediately. "That is what people always say. Temporary becomes permanent before you even realize it. I cannot build a future on hope alone." There was a silence that followed, not empty, but full of everything neither of them was saying. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "So you're already planning to leave?" Olivia's expression tightened slightly, caught between honesty and avoidance. "I'm just being realistic." Ethan gave a faint nod, as if that answered more than she intended. Outside, a car passed, its reflection sliding across the window beside them, distorting their images for a brief second before disappearing. Inside, the distance between them felt wider than the small table could hold. Olivia reached for her bag, her movements deliberate now, as if a decision had already been made somewhere deep inside her. "I have plans tonight," she said, standing up before he could respond. Ethan did not try to stop her. He simply watched as she adjusted her coat, her expression composed, her eyes avoiding his. As she turned to leave, she paused for a fraction of a second, her back still to him. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." The words sounded like closure. Then she walked out, the bell above the door ringing sharply as it closed behind her. Ethan remained seated, the untouched coffee cooling in front of him, the faint echo of her presence lingering in the empty chair across from him. He looked down at his watch, the worn leather strap steady against his wrist, and for the first time since this began, he felt the full weight of what this test might cost. Not money, not power, but something far more difficult to measure. And somewhere across the city, Olivia stepped into a waiting car, Ryan already inside, his smile easy, confident, certain of the direction things were heading. She returned the smile, but as the car pulled away, her gaze drifted once more to the passing streets, to something she could not quite leave behind, even as she tried. The line had already been crossed long before Ethan Blake saw it with his own eyes, but that did not make the moment any less sharp when it finally happened. The afternoon sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as Ethan stepped out of the hardware store, his muscles sore, his shirt damp with the honest weight of another day's work. He rolled his shoulders slightly, feeling the tension settle into his bones, then started down the street without any particular destination in mind. The air carried the scent of exhaust and distant food carts, a familiar mix that now felt strangely grounding. He was halfway past a row of glass front buildings when something caught his attention. Not a sound, not a voice, but a reflection. In the polished surface of a storefront window, he saw her. Olivia. She stood just a few feet behind him on the opposite side of the street, her posture relaxed, her expression lighter than he had seen in days. And beside her stood Ryan Cole, close enough that there was no space left for doubt. Ethan slowed, his steps instinctively quieting as his gaze fixed on the reflection rather than turning around. He did not want to interrupt the moment. He wanted to see it clearly. Ryan leaned in slightly, saying something that made Olivia laugh. Not the polite laugh she used with strangers, but something more genuine, more open. Then his hand moved to the small of her back, casual, familiar, and she did not step away. That was all it took. A simple gesture, a silent acceptance. Ethan stood there for a fraction longer than he should have, his reflection blending into the glass, invisible even to himself. Then Olivia spoke, her voice carrying just enough through the open air to reach him. I cannot keep going backwards, Ryan. I tried. I really did. But I deserve something stable. Something real. Ryan nodded, as if he had been waiting for those words. And now you have it. She smiled, soft, certain, as if a decision had finally settled into place. Yes, I do. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in pain, not in anger, but in recognition. This was the truth. Not what she said to him, not what she hesitated to admit. This. When he opened his eyes again, his expression had not changed, but something inside him had. The last thread of uncertainty was gone. He stepped forward, continuing down the sidewalk as if he had never stopped, as if he had never seen them at all. Across the street, Olivia turned slightly, her gaze drifting for no clear reason, as if something in her sensed a shift she could not explain. For a brief moment, her eyes scanned the crowd, searching, but Ethan was already gone, just another figure disappearing into the movement of the city. That evening, Ethan returned to the diner, the familiar bell above the door ringing softly as he stepped inside. The warmth met him immediately, wrapping around the quiet storm he carried within. Mrs. Green looked up from behind the counter and studied him for a moment before speaking. Something changed today. It was not a question. Ethan took his usual seat, his movement steady, controlled. Yes. She poured his coffee without another word, placing the cup in front of him with a gentleness that contrasted the weight of his silence. He stared at the surface of the dark liquid for a moment before speaking. It is one thing to suspect who someone is. It is another to see it without any doubt. Mrs. Green nodded slowly. And which one hurts more? Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. The second, because you cannot pretend anymore. She leaned slightly closer, her voice softer now. And what will you do with that truth? Ethan lifted his wrist, his thumb brushing over the worn watch, grounding himself in something that had never changed. I will remember it. He looked up, his eyes calm, steady, clearer than before. And I will finish what I started. Mrs. Green studied him for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod. Good. Because most people stop halfway. They see the truth, and they run from it. Ethan shook his head slightly. I did not come this far to run. Outside, the night settled over the city once more, lights flickering on, shadows stretching longer, and somewhere within that shifting landscape, two paths had fully separated. Olivia stepped deeper into a world built on comfort and appearance, convinced she had chosen correctly, while Ethan walked further into discomfort and clarity, knowing that what he had just witnessed was not the end of something valuable, but the beginning of understanding exactly what that value had always been. And soon, when the truth came back around, it would not be quiet, and it would not be easy to ignore. The decision did not come with hesitation, and it did not come with anger. It came with clarity, the kind that settled deep and left no room for doubt. By the time the next morning arrived, Ethan Blake was already awake, sitting in the quiet stillness of his small apartment, the early light barely touching the edges of the room. His hands rested loosely together, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as if he were looking beyond the walls, beyond the life he had stepped into, back towards something he had deliberately left behind. The test was no longer about wondering. It was about confirming. And now it was complete. He reached for his phone and stared at the screen for a moment before dialing a number he had ignored for days. Clara answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with relief and frustration at the same time. "Ethan, where have you been? Do you have any idea what is happening here?" He did not interrupt her. He let her speak, let the urgency spill out, let the world he had stepped away from rush back into his ear. When she finally paused, he spoke, calm and controlled. "Schedule a meeting with the board." Silence fell instantly. Claire did not need to ask what that meant. "You're coming back," she said quietly. "Yes." His answer was simple, but it carried weight. "When?" "Tonight." There was a brief pause, then a shift in her tone, something steadier, more aligned with the version of him she had always known. "I will have everything ready." Ethan ended the call and set the phone down, his eyes moving slowly around the small apartment one last time. The worn couch, the narrow kitchen, the quiet emptiness that had taught him more in a few days than years of success ever had. He stood, adjusting his sleeves, his fingers brushing over the watch on his wrist. The leather was still worn. The scratches were still there. Nothing about it had changed, and neither had the lesson it carried. Money reveals people, not their words, not their promises, their choices. Across the city, Olivia Hayes stood in front of a mirror in a high-rise apartment, the soft light reflecting off polished surfaces and clean lines that spoke of comfort and status. She adjusted the strap of her dress, her movements careful, practiced, as if she were stepping into a role she had already decided to play. Behind her, Ryan Cole leaned casually against the doorway, watching her with an approving smile. "There is an event tonight," he said. "Important people, investors, executives, the kind of room where opportunities are made." Olivia met his gaze through the reflection. "And you want me there?" Ryan stepped closer, his tone confident. "I want you to see what your future looks like." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right." The word felt firm, but something beneath it remained unsettled, like a quiet echo she could not silence. Back in the apartment, Ethan reached for his jacket, the same simple one he had worn every day, and slipped it on. He picked up his keys, then paused, his hand resting briefly on the counter. For a moment, the silence pressed in again, not heavy this time, but steady, like a final breath before something shifted. Then he walked out, closing the door behind him without looking back. The city moved around him as it always did, unaware of what was about to change, unaware that the man walking among them, unnoticed, unrecognized, was about to step back into a world that would recognize him instantly. By the time the sun began to set, the skyline had transformed, glass towers reflecting gold and orange light, the streets below filling with movement as the night prepared to take over. Ethan stood at the edge of that transition, no longer divided between two lives, no longer testing, no longer waiting. He had seen enough. He had learned enough. And now it was time to return, not to prove who he was, but to reveal who everyone else had shown themselves to be when they believed he was nothing. And somewhere across the city, Olivia stepped into a waiting car beside Ryan. Her reflection briefly caught in the window as it pulled away, carrying her toward a night that would feel like a beginning, but would soon become something else entirely. Because in just a few hours, the truth she had chosen to ignore would stand in front of her, undeniable, unshakable, and impossible to escape. The building rose like a pillar of glass and light against the night sky, every window glowing, every reflection sharp and controlled, a place where power gathered quietly behind polished doors. Black cars lined the entrance, engines humming softly as valets moved with precision, opening doors, greeting guests, guiding them into a world that existed just slightly above the rest of the city. Olivia Hayes stepped out of the car beside Ryan Cole, her heels touching the smooth pavement as she lifted her gaze toward the towering structure. For a brief moment, she hesitated, the scale of it all pressing in, but Ryan's hand at her back was steady, confident. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low, assured. "You'll be fine." Olivia nodded, drawing a breath as she adjusted her posture, her expression settling into something composed, something ready. Inside, the lobby stretched wide and immaculate, marble floors reflecting the soft, golden light from above, voices blending into a quiet hum of conversation that carried influence and expectation. Men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, all moving with the ease of belonging. Olivia felt it immediately, the difference between being invited and truly fitting in. Ryan greeted people as they passed, nods, handshakes, brief exchanges that carried meaning without needing explanation. "This is where everything happens," he murmured as they moved toward the main hall. "Deals, decisions, futures." Olivia glanced around, taking it in, her eyes widening slightly despite her effort to remain composed. It was everything she had said she wanted. Stability, security, more. The main hall opened before them, a vast space filled with soft music, crystal glasses, and conversations layered with ambition. At the far end, a raised platform stood beneath a backdrop of the company's insignia, a symbol that carried weight in every corner of the industry. Olivia studied it for a moment, something about it feeling familiar, though she could not place why. Ryan followed her gaze and smiled. "Impressive, is it not?" She nodded. "Who owns all of this?" Ryan let out a quiet breath, almost amused. "A man who built it from nothing. No family money, no shortcuts, just vision and control." Olivia tilted her head slightly, curiosity stirring. "Have you met him?" Ryan shook his head. "Not personally. He is selective. Rarely appears without reason." That only made the room feel heavier, as if the presence of someone unseen still shaped everything around them. Across the hall, near the entrance that most guests no longer noticed, a figure stepped inside without announcement, without hesitation. Ethan Blake moved through the space with quiet certainty, his presence shifting the air in a way that was not immediately visible, but deeply felt. Gone were the worn boots and plain jacket. In their place stood a man in a perfectly tailored suit, every detail precise, every movement controlled. The watch remained on his wrist, unchanged, its worn leather the only piece that did not match the rest. Conversation slowed as he passed, subtle at first, then more noticeable, eyes turning, voices lowering, recognition spreading in waves. One by one, people adjusted, straightened, stepped aside, not out of fear, out of respect. Clara appeared at his side almost instantly, her expression composed, but her eyes carrying a quiet relief. "Everything is ready," she said softly. "The board is waiting." Ethan gave a slight nod, his gaze moving across the room, not searching, not uncertain, simply observing. And then, for a fraction of a second, his eyes met Olivia's from across the distance. She did not recognize him immediately. Not the man standing there now, framed by power, defined by presence. But something in her expression shifted, a flicker of confusion, of recognition trying to surface. Ryan noticed the change in her focus and followed her gaze. The moment his eyes landed on Ethan, his posture adjusted instantly, his confidence tightening into something more careful. "That is him," Ryan said quietly, his voice no longer casual. Olivia blinked, her breath catching slightly. Him, the man who owned everything in this room, the man who built it from nothing, the man standing only a few yards away. And yet something about him felt disturbingly familiar. Ethan did not look away. He held her gaze just long enough for the realization to begin forming, not fully, not completely, but enough to unsettle the certainty she had been holding on to. Then he turned, moving toward the center of the room as the quiet anticipation of his presence grew stronger, heavier, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, the world Olivia had chosen began to shift beneath her feet, the illusion cracking just enough to reveal something she was not ready to face. The moment the room shifted, it did not happen with noise, but with silence. A subtle, spreading silence that moved from one corner to another as more eyes turned, more conversations paused, more people recognized the presence that had just entered their world. Ethan Blake stepped onto the polished floor of the main hall with the same calm precision he had carried through boardrooms and negotiations. For years, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. The soft music continued to play, but it felt distant now, like something happening behind glass. Clara moved slightly ahead, signaling discreetly to the event coordinator, and within seconds, the attention of the entire room began to gather toward the raised platform. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice announced smoothly, cutting through the remaining conversations with practiced ease, please welcome the founder and principal owner of Blake Holdings, Ethan Blake. The name landed with weight. It echoed, not loudly, but deeply, as if it carried a gravity that could not be ignored. Applause followed, controlled, respectful, but filled with a recognition that went beyond politeness. This was not just another executive. This was the man who had built the very ground they were standing on. Across the room, Olivia Hayes froze. The name did not just reach her ears. It struck something deeper, something that connected instantly to a memory she had not allowed herself to revisit fully. Ethan Blake. Her breath caught as her gaze locked onto him again. This time, not as a stranger, not as a distant figure of power, but as the man she had sat across from in a small coffee shop, the man she had walked away from without looking back. The difference was not in his face. It was in everything else. The way the room moved around him. The way people stepped aside without being asked. The way authority followed him without effort. This was not a transformation. This was a revelation. Beside her, Ryan Cole's posture tightened further, his confidence shifting into something more calculated, more cautious. He leaned slightly closer, his voice low. Stay composed. Olivia did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan as he reached the platform. Each step measured, each movement controlled. The applause faded gradually as he turned to face the room, his gaze sweeping across the crowd once, not searching, not hesitating, but acknowledging. When his eyes passed over Olivia, they did not stop. Not yet. He allowed the silence to settle fully before speaking. Thank you for being here tonight. His voice was calm, steady, carrying easily across the room without force. This company was built on a simple idea. That value is not determined by what is seen, but by what is proven. A slight pause followed, just long enough to draw attention deeper, just long enough to make the words land. Over the past weeks, I have taken time away from this world, not to escape it, but to observe it, to understand it without the influence of position or perception. Murmurs moved softly through the crowd, curiosity rising, interest sharpening. Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. When you remove the appearance of success, when you take away the symbols that define status, what remains is truth. Not the version people present when they believe they are being seen, but the version they reveal when they believe they are not. Olivia's chest tightened as each word settled into place, as if they were not meant for the room, but for her. Ryan shifted slightly beside her, his expression now carefully neutral, but his eyes attentive, calculating. Ethan's gaze moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, and then it found her. This time, he did not look away. The connection was immediate, undeniable, and it held for a moment that felt longer than it should have. In that silence, everything she had said, everything she had chosen, everything she had justified, seemed to rise around her at once. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes made the distance between them feel smaller, sharper, impossible to ignore. Then he turned his attention back to the room. So tonight is not just about celebrating success, he continued. It is about recognizing what success reveals. Because in the end, it is not what you have that defines you. It is what you choose when you believe no one is watching. The room remained still, the weight of his words settling over every person present. But for Olivia, the silence was louder than anything she had ever heard. Because in that moment, she understood something she could no longer deny. She had not lost Ethan when he walked out of that restaurant. She had lost him long before that, in every choice she had made when she thought he had nothing left to offer. And now, standing in a room built by the very man she had dismissed, she could feel the truth closing in around her, undeniable, unescapable, and far too late to undo. The applause had faded, but the weight of Ethan Blake's words remained suspended in the air, pressing quietly against every person in the room. Conversations did not resume right away. Instead, there was a hesitation, a collective pause, as if everyone was recalibrating, reassessing not just what they had heard, but what it meant for them. Ethan stepped down from the platform with the same composed precision, his expression unchanged, his presence still commanding without effort. Clara moved beside him, already coordinating the next sequence of the evening, but Ethan's attention had shifted elsewhere. Across the room, Olivia Hayes could no longer look away. The realization had settled fully now. No longer a flicker, no longer question. The man she had dismissed, the man she had walked away from, the man she had called not enough, stood at the center of everything she had believed she wanted. Her breath felt uneven, her thoughts no longer aligned with the certainty she had carried into that room. Ryan Cole sensed it immediately. He leaned closer, his voice low, controlled. "Do not react. Not here." But Olivia barely heard him. Her focus remained locked on Ethan as he moved through the crowd, greeted by executives, investors, people whose names carried weight in industries she had only recently begun to understand. Each handshake, each quiet exchange reinforced the truth she could no longer deny. This was his world. It had always been his world, and she had never seen it. Or worse, she had never looked. Without thinking, Olivia stepped forward, her movement subtle at first, then more deliberate as she began to cross the room. Ryan reached for her arm lightly. "Olivia, wait." But she pulled away, not sharply, but with a quiet urgency that did not need explanation. She moved past clusters of guests, her heels steady against the polished floor, her gaze fixed, her mind racing ahead of her steps. When she finally reached him, he had just finished speaking with another executive. The man nodded respectfully before stepping aside, leaving a brief, clear space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the room seemed to dim again, not completely, but enough to isolate the silence that formed around them. Ethan looked at her, not surprised, not unsettled, simply aware. Olivia's voice came out softer than she expected. Ethan, his name felt different now, heavier, carrying everything she had not understood before. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her presence without invitation. Olivia swallowed, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath. "I did not." "No." The words sounded weak even as she said them. Ethan's gaze remained steady. "No," he replied calmly. "You did not." She took a step closer, lowering her voice, her tone shifting from disbelief to something more urgent. "Why did you not tell me?" Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then answered with quiet clarity. "Because I needed to know what you would choose if I had nothing to offer you." The words landed without force, but they carried more impact than anything louder could have. Olivia's expression tightened, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something that might soften the truth. "That is not fair," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You tested me." Ethan shook his head slightly. "I removed everything that could influence your decision. What remained was your choice." Olivia's breath caught, the distinction cutting deeper than she expected. Around them, the room continued to move, but it no longer mattered. In that moment, there was only the space between them and the weight of everything that had filled it. "I thought you had nothing," she admitted, the words finally breaking through her restraint. Ethan did not look away. "And now you know that I did." She shook her head quickly, emotion rising now, breaking through the control she had maintained all evening. "That is not what I meant. I was scared. I did not want to build a life on uncertainty." Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but his voice carried a quiet finality. "You were not afraid of uncertainty. You were afraid of losing comfort." The truth settled between them, undeniable, leaving no space for argument. Olivia's eyes filled with something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Regret, real and immediate. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan studied her for a moment, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something far more distant. Understanding without attachment. "Yes," he replied simply. "You did." The simplicity of his answer struck harder than any accusation. Olivia stepped closer again, her voice softer now, more vulnerable than it had been since this began. "Then let me fix it." The words hung there, fragile, uncertain, waiting for something that might still be possible. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, the room around them fading once more as he considered not her words, but the truth behind them. And for the first time since she had walked away, Olivia realized that the power in that moment no longer belonged to her choice. It belonged entirely to his. The silence between them stretched longer than either of them expected, but this time it was not fragile. It was final. Ethan Blake did not rush to answer, did not fill the space with words that would soften what had already been decided. Instead, he looked at Olivia Hayes with a calm that carried distance. Not anger, not pain, but something far more resolved. Around them, the room had slowly begun to breathe again. Conversations returning in low murmurs, glasses clinking softly, but there was a subtle awareness that lingered, a sense that something important was unfolding in a quiet corner of the evening. Olivia waited, her eyes searching his face, her voice already softer than before, almost pleading. "Ethan, please. I know I was wrong. I see it now." He studied her for a moment longer, not the words, but the timing of them, the weight behind them, the reason they had come now and not before. Then he spoke, his voice steady, controlled, leaving no space for misunderstanding. "You do see it now, but not because it changed, because I did not." The words settled between them, clear and unavoidable. Olivia shook her head slightly, stepping closer, her composure slipping further with each second. "That is not true. I always cared about you. I just did not understand what was happening. I thought you were losing everything. I thought I had to protect myself." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, unshaken. "And who were you protecting yourself from?" The question was simple, but it cut through every explanation she tried to hold on to. Olivia hesitated, her mouth opening slightly before no answer came. The silence that followed spoke for her. Ethan nodded once, as if that silence confirmed everything he needed. "You were not protecting yourself from me," he continued quietly. "You were protecting yourself from a life that did not meet your expectations." Olivia's eyes filled with emotion she could no longer contain, her voice breaking just enough to reveal it. "I was scared." Ethan did not raise his voice, did not step back, but something in him had already moved beyond where she stood. "Fear does not make you walk away from someone," he said. "It makes you hold on to them." What you felt was not fear. It was doubt, and doubt makes decisions permanent. The words landed with a weight that left no room for reinterpretation. Olivia shook her head again, more urgently now, as if trying to push back against something already set in place. "Then give me another chance," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "I can prove that I am not that person. I can choose differently." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, there was a trace of something softer in his expression. Not hope, not reconsideration, but recognition of what they once had before everything was tested. Then he slowly shook his head. "You already did prove who you are," he replied. "You just did not know you were being honest at the time." Olivia's breath caught, the finality of his words breaking through whatever remained of her expectation. Around them, a few people glanced in their direction, sensing the shift, the quiet intensity that no longer matched the rest of the room. Ryan stood several steps away now, watching carefully, his expression guarded, calculating, but even he understood that this moment no longer belonged to him. Olivia took one last step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "So that is it. You're just going to walk away." Ethan's gaze softened slightly, but his answer did not. "No." He paused just long enough for the distinction to matter. "I'm not walking away from you. I am walking toward the truth you showed me." The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. Olivia's shoulders lowered slightly, the strength she had tried to hold on finally giving way to something quieter, something heavier. Regret had replaced certainty, and there was nothing left to hold it back. Ethan reached for his glass from a nearby table, taking a small sip, his movements calm, controlled, as if the moment had already passed for him. Then he set the glass down and stepped back, creating a space between them that felt wider than before, not because of distance, but because of decision. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, his tone sincere but distant. Olivia did not respond. She could not. Because for the first time, she understood that what she had been looking for was never missing. She had simply chosen not to see it when it mattered. Ethan gave a slight nod, a quiet acknowledgement of what had once been, then turned and walked away, his presence once again blending into the flow of the evening, leaving behind a silence that no apology could fill. And as Olivia stood there, surrounded by everything she had believed she wanted, she felt something she had never expected to feel in that room. Loss. Not of status, not of opportunity, but of something real that she had traded for an illusion she could no longer hold on to. The night continued around Olivia Hayes as if nothing had changed, as if the music, the laughter, and the quiet exchanges of power had not just witnessed something that had shifted her entire world. People moved past her, glasses raised, conversations flowing, but she remained still, her body present while her thoughts unraveled somewhere far beneath the surface. The space where Ethan Blake had stood moments ago now felt impossibly distant, even though he had only taken a few steps away. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the crowd, but he had already disappeared into it, absorbed by a world that clearly belonged to him. Ryan Cole approached her carefully, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp, assessing. "You should not have done that," he said quietly, his voice carrying a controlled edge. Olivia did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained unfocused, as if she were still standing in that moment, replaying every word, every look, every truth she had tried to deny. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "He put you in a difficult position. You reacted emotionally. It happens." Olivia blinked, finally turning to look at him, but something in her expression had changed. The certainty that had once aligned with his words was gone. "No," she said softly. "He did not put me anywhere. I chose it." Ryan studied her, his patience thinning slightly. "Then you chose wrong." The statement was blunt, almost dismissive, as if the solution were as simple as adjusting direction and moving forward. Olivia held his gaze, but for the first time, she did not find reassurance in it. She found distance. "I already did," she replied quietly. Ryan exhaled, shifting his stance, his tone sharpening just enough to reveal the difference between confidence and control. "You're overthinking this. You are. Here now. This is what matters. The rest is behind you." Olivia glanced around the room again, at the polished surfaces, the carefully constructed image of success that had once drawn her in so easily. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet it felt hollow in a way she could not ignore anymore. "Is it?" she asked, more to herself than to him. Ryan followed her gaze, misunderstanding the question. "Of course it is. This is where you belong." Olivia shook her head slightly, not in rejection, but in realization. "No," she said, her voice steadier now. "This is where I thought I belonged." The difference settled between them, subtle but significant. Ryan's expression tightened, his control slipping just enough to reveal irritation. "Do not confuse regret with reality," he said. "You made a practical decision. Do not ruin it by second-guessing yourself now." Olivia met his gaze, and for the first time since she had stepped into that world, she saw something clearly. This was not stability. This was calculation. This was not security. This was convenience. And suddenly, it was not enough. Across the room, Ethan stood near the far end of the hall, engaged in conversation with members of the board, his posture composed, his focus sharp, but his awareness extended beyond the discussion. He did not look toward Olivia again. He did not need to. What needed to be seen had already been revealed. Clara spoke beside him, outlining the next phase of expansion, her tone precise, efficient, but Ethan's response came with a quiet finality that signaled something had shifted beyond business. "Proceed with the restructuring," he said calmly, "and make sure the community initiative moves forward as planned." Clara nodded, though her eyes flickered with curiosity. This was new, a direction that reflected something deeper than profit or growth. Meanwhile, Olivia took a step back from Ryan, the physical distance mirroring something internal that had already separated them. "I need some air," she said, her voice calm but distant. Ryan frowned slightly. "This is not the time." Olivia did not argue. She simply turned and walked away, her steps steady, her mind clearer than it had been all night. As she moved through the crowd, past conversations that no longer held meaning, past faces that no longer impressed her, she felt the weight of everything she had chosen begin to shift. Not disappear, not undo, but change. Because for the first time, she was not chasing something external. She was confronting something internal. And outside, as the night air met her, cool and unfiltered, Olivia realized that the life she had believed was an upgrade now felt like a mask she could no longer wear. And inside, Ethan Blake stood at the center of a world he controlled, no longer questioning, no longer testing, but moving forward with a clarity that had been earned, not given. Because the truth had done what it always does. It had revealed everything. The city felt different in the quiet hours before sunrise, when the noise had not yet returned and the streets held a kind of stillness that allowed truth to settle without distraction. Ethan Blake stood near the window of his office, high above the city that had shaped him, his gaze steady as the first light touched the skyline. The night of the gala was already behind him, not as a memory he needed to revisit, but as a conclusion he had already accepted. Clara stepped into the room quietly, placing a folder on his desk. "The restructuring is moving forward," she said, "and the community initiative you approved is already getting attention." Ethan nodded slightly, his attention still on the horizon. "Good. Make sure it reaches the people who actually need it." Clara studied him for a moment, then allowed herself a small, knowing smile before leaving the room. There was something different about him now, something quieter but stronger. Not the weight of power, but the clarity of purpose. Across the city, Olivia Hayes sat alone on a park bench, her coat wrapped tightly around her as the early morning air lingered cool against her skin. The world around her was simple, unpolished, real in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. People passed by without recognition, without expectation, each one carrying their own direction, their own purpose. She watched them, her thoughts no longer racing, no longer trying to justify or explain. The truth had settled, and with it came something she could not avoid. Responsibility, not for what she had lost, but for the choices that had led her there. Her phone rested in her hand, the screen dark, a message drafted but not sent. She had written it more than once. Changed the words, erased them, tried again, but nothing felt right. Because there was no sentence that could undo what had already been revealed. After a moment, she exhaled slowly and locked the screen, placing the phone beside her. Some things were not meant to be fixed. Some things were meant to be understood. Back in his office, Ethan turned from the window and walked to his desk, his movements calm, deliberate. He reached for a small envelope that had been set aside, one that contained something far more valuable than anything in the room. Inside was a single photograph, worn at the edges, of a much younger version of himself standing beside his father. Both of them smiling, both of them unaware of what life would demand of them later. Ethan looked at it for a moment, then set it back down carefully. His hand moved to the watch on his wrist, his thumb brushing over the scratched glass, grounding himself once more in the lesson that had never changed. Money reveals people. It always had. It always would. Later that afternoon, Ethan stepped out of his building and into the city once again, but this time not as someone hiding, not as someone testing, but as someone moving forward without question. As he walked, his path carried him past a familiar corner, a place he had come to know in a way he had not expected. The small diner still stood there, its sign flickering slightly, its windows warm against the afternoon light. He paused for a moment, then stepped inside. The bell rang softly above the door, and Mrs. Green looked up from behind the counter, her eyes lighting with recognition. "There you are," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan took his usual seat, the same one he had sat in when everything had been uncertain. Now it felt different, not because the place had changed, but because he had. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded. "And something to eat." She gave a small approving nod and moved to prepare it. As Ethan sat there, the quiet hum of the diner surrounding him, he realized something that had not been clear before. He had not lost anything that was meant to stay. He had only revealed what was never meant to last. Outside, the city continued as it always did, full of movement, full of choices, full of people revealing who they were in ways both small and significant. And somewhere within that same city, Olivia walked her own path, no longer chasing what looked right, but learning to understand what actually was. Their lives would not cross again, not in the way they once had, but that was not failure. That was clarity, because in the end, the test had never been about love alone. It had been about truth. And truth, once revealed, does not ask for permission. It simply remains.